Sarah Chen's knees buckled when she saw the bear. Not from fear, though fear was there, cold and sharp in her chest, settling like ice behind her ribs. She buckled because of the white chevron marking on the massive animal's chest, distinctive as a fingerprint, unmistakable even from 30 feet away, through the grey morning light filtering through the pines. The same marking she'd seen 5 years before on a terrified cub caught in a snare, bleeding and alone and crying in a way that still haunted Sarah's dreams. But that wasn't what made her heart stop. It was what lay beneath the bear's enormous body. Emma, her 4-year-old granddaughter, motionless on the muddy bank of the stream, her small form curled on its side, lips blue as a winter sky, skin pale as paper. And the bear, this wild 500-pound black bear, curled protectively around the child like a mother around her newborn, her massive body forming a warm semicircle of fur and muscle around Emma's tiny frame. The bear's head was up, alert, watching Sarah with eyes that held no aggression, no fear, no threat. Only recognition, only patience, only waiting. Sarah's mind couldn't process what her eyes were seeing. Every cell in her body screamed contradictions at her nervous system: run, stay, fight, trust, scream, silence. The bear should have fled the moment Sarah crashed into the clearing, should have bolted at the sound of human footsteps, the scent of human sweat and panic carried on the wind, should have defended her position with teeth and claws if she felt threatened, if she perceived Sarah as a danger to whatever claim she had on the small human body beneath her. Should have done anything, literally anything, except what she was doing, which was looking directly at Sarah deliberately, with an intensity that felt almost human in its intentionality, as if to say, "I've been waiting for you. I knew you would come." Sarah took one trembling step forward, her boots squelching in the mud. The bear didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't so much as twitch an ear. Another step, Sarah's breath coming in ragged gasps that sounded too loud in the clearing. The bear's gaze never wavered from Sarah's face, brown eyes locked on human eyes across 30 feet of space that felt like 30 miles. Sarah's throat closed completely. She tried to speak, tried to call Emma's name, tried to make any sound at all, but nothing came, just the rush of the stream behind them, swollen with snowmelt and running fast over stones, just the whisper of wind through pine branches overhead, just the impossible tableau before her, wild predator and human child, intertwined in a scene that violated every principle of wildlife behavior Sarah had learned in 20 years as a forest ranger in Northern California. Then the bear did something that shattered Sarah's understanding of the natural world completely. She lifted her massive head slowly, looked down at Emma with what could only be described as tenderness, then back up at Sarah. A deliberate communication, a message passed across species boundaries. "See, I have kept her safe. Now you are here." And, slowly, with movements so careful they seemed choreographed, rehearsed, the bear began to shift her body away from the child, not quickly, not with alarm, but with intention. Creating space, making room, making an offering, giving Emma back. Sarah's vision blurred with tears she didn't understand. Her hands shook so violently she couldn't feel her fingers anymore, couldn't be sure they were still attached to her wrists, because she knew this bear, knew those brown eyes, knew that white chevron marking the way you know a scar on your own body, the way you recognize your mother's handwriting, the way certain memories burn themselves into your brain and refuse to fade no matter how many years pass. She knew that marking like she knew the scars on her own forearms, scars that suddenly burned with memory, phantom pain shooting through tissue that had healed 5 years ago but would never truly forget. 5 years collapsed into 5 seconds. Time folded in on itself. A different clearing, a different season, spring instead of this cold April morning. The same eyes looking at her, filled not with calm and patience, but with terror and agony. A cub, a snare, blood in the mud, Sarah's hands working to free the trap, while the cub's claws raked her arms, that white chevron rising and falling with panicked breaths. It was early spring then, too, 5 years before that impossible morning when Sarah found Emma and the bear together. The forest had been different then, younger somehow, or maybe Sarah had been younger, less worn by the weight of seasons and rescues that didn't always end well. She'd been on routine patrol through the mixed conifer forests of the North Coast region, checking trail conditions after the winter snowmelt had finally receded enough to make the high country accessible again. March, bleeding into April, the same transitional season when nature couldn't quite decide between winter's grip and spring's promise. The morning had been unremarkable in every way. The kind of day that comprised 99% of ranger work, mundane, necessary, utterly forgettable. Sarah had been documenting fallen trees across hiking paths, photographing erosion damage where streams had jumped their banks during heavy rains, updating trail markers that had been knocked askew by winter storms or wandering elk. She'd been walking for 3 hours through terrain she knew like the lines on her own palms, her mind half on her work and half on whether she'd remembered to defrost chicken for dinner when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the cathedral quiet of old-growth forest, high-pitched, desperate, the kind of cry that triggers something primal in the human brain, something older than language, something that says with absolute certainty, a young creature is dying. Not the quick shriek of a hunt, predator closing on prey in nature's brutal efficiency. This was sustained agony, the sound of something trapped, something suffering, something that had been crying for so long its voice was beginning to fail. Sarah followed the sound through dense undergrowth, branches catching at her uniform, scratching her face, her heart rate climbing with each step deeper into the forest. She'd heard plenty of animal distress calls in her career, deer caught in fences, raccoons trapped in culverts. Once, memorably, a mountain lion with its paw stuck in a rancher's illegally placed leg-hold trap. Most times, the kindest thing a ranger could do was nothing. Nature has its own mathematics, its own brutal equations of predator and prey, survival and death. Intervention disrupts those equations, creates dependencies, alters behaviors in ways that can doom an animal more surely than whatever danger it currently faced. But this sound was different. Sarah knew it in her bones before her brain could articulate why. Not the quick terror of a hunt that would end in seconds one way or another. This was suffering without purpose, without the clean logic of the food chain, something trapped, something in pain for no reason except human cruelty or carelessness. She moved faster, pushing through manzanita bushes that clawed at her clothes, following the weakening cries. She found the cub in a small clearing ringed by manzanita and young Douglas fir. Young, maybe 4 months old, small enough that Sarah could have cradled her in her arms if circumstances had been different. The kind of small that made your chest ache, that activated every maternal instinct evolution had wired into the human nervous system. The cub was caught in a leg-hold snare, the kind that had been illegal in California for decades but still appeared in remote areas like ghosts of an uglier time, set by poachers targeting bobcats and coyotes, indifferent to what else might stumble into their killing zones. The wire had closed around the cub's left front paw, and she'd been fighting it for hours, maybe longer. Sarah could read the story written in torn earth and trampled vegetation. The ground around the cub was churned into chaos, muddy and scarred by desperate struggle. Blood matted her black fur, dark and wet where the wire had cut through skin. Her cries had diminished to whimpers by the time Sarah arrived, exhaustion and shock beginning to shut her small body down in the way that dying things do when they've fought as hard as they can and have nothing left to fight with. Sarah knelt in the mud, 10 feet from the trapped cub, her radio already in her hand, thumb pressing the call button with practiced efficiency. Her voice came out steadier than she felt as she reported her location and situation to dispatch. Wildlife rescue team needed injured black bear cub, approximately 4 months old, caught in illegal leg-hold snare. Coordinates followed, rattled off from memory because Sarah knew every grid square of her territory the way other people knew their own neighborhoods. The response crackled back through static. Nearest wildlife rescue team was in Eureka, 2 hours out on good roads, maybe longer given the condition of the fire roads this early in the season. They were mobilizing now. Stay at a safe distance, do not approach. Standard protocol. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and lowered the radio to her lap, staring at the cub who'd stopped struggling and now simply lay in the mud, panting, her small sides heaving with exhausted breaths. 2 hours. Sarah had seen enough animals in shock to know what 2 hours meant. The cub's breathing was already shallow and rapid, her eyes glazing over with the particular emptiness that comes when a body begins shutting down non-essential systems to preserve the core. Shock was setting in, that cascade of physiological collapse that killed as surely as any predator. In 2 hours, there would be nothing to rescue but a small body. Sarah would file a report. Document the illegal snare. Maybe, if they were very lucky, catch whoever had set it. But the cub would be dead. Sarah made the decision in the space between 3 heartbeats. She set down her radio. She began talking, her voice low and steady, the same tone she'd used with her own daughter Michelle when she'd been small and frightened by thunderstorms or shadows that looked like monsters in the dark. Nonsense words, soothing sounds, anything to penetrate the cub's panic and communicate something other than threat. It's okay, little one. I know it hurts. I know you're scared. I'm going to help you. Just hold on for me. Just hold on. She moved slowly, telegraphing every motion, keeping her body language as non-threatening as possible, which was difficult when you were 6 feet of human approaching a wild predator, even a small one. Each step was deliberate, announced, giving the cub time to process that this large creature moving toward her wasn't attacking, wasn't threatening, was somehow different from everything her instincts screamed about humans. The cub watched her approach with eyes gone glassy from pain and terror, too exhausted to do more than track Sarah's movement with her head. When Sarah was close enough to touch, close enough to smell the cub's fear and blood mixing with the rich earth scent of disturbed soil, the young bear made one final attempt to flee. Pure instinct overriding exhaustion. She lunged against the snare, the movement reflexive and futile, and her free paw lashed out in panic. Claws caught Sarah's forearm, raking deep furrows through skin and muscle with shocking efficiency. Black bear claws were designed to climb trees and dig for grubs, sharp and curved and devastating when applied to unprotected human flesh. Pain exploded white-hot across Sarah's arm, immediate and absolute. Blood welled up instantly, soaking through her uniform, sleeve, hot and sticky. Sarah gasped but didn't pull back. Couldn't pull back, because the cub had used the last of her strength in that desperate swipe and now hung limp in the snare's grip, her small body suspended at an unnatural angle, panting, defeated, waiting for death because she had nothing left to fight with. Sarah gritted her teeth against the pain screaming through her arm and reached for the trap mechanism with hands that were slippery with her own blood, Her fingers fumbled at the release, the design older than she was, simple but effective in its cruelty. The snare was spring-loaded, designed to close tight and stay closed, to hold whatever stepped into it until the trapper returned to collect his prize or dispose of his mistake. Sarah had to brace her boot against an exposed root for leverage, had to use both hands despite the pain radiating from her torn forearm, had to work the stiff mechanism while the cub whimpered and thrashed weakly against her grip. 3 minutes. The work took 3 minutes that felt like 30, each second marked by the cub's labored breathing and Sarah's own racing heartbeat, and the wet drip of blood falling from her arm into mud already stained with the cub's blood. Her fingers ached, her arm burned, sweat ran down her face despite the cool morning air. And then, finally, the mechanism released with a metallic click that sounded impossibly loud in the clearing. The wildlife rescue team arrived 90 minutes later to find Sarah still sitting in that clearing, her arm bandaged with strips torn from her own shirt, the fabric already soaked through with blood that had finally begun to clot. The sprung snare lay in the mud beside her like evidence of a crime, which it was: illegal trapping, animal cruelty, 6 violations that would result in fines and possibly jail time if they ever found who'd set it. Sarah gave her statement in a voice that sounded distant to her own ears, detached, as if she were describing events that had happened to someone else. They treated her wounds there in the forest, the lead veterinarian cleaning the deep furrows with antiseptic that burned worse than the initial injury, muttering about infection risk and the importance of proper medical care. He told Sarah what she already knew. The cub's injuries were serious but not necessarily fatal. Young bears were resilient, he said, packing gauze against her arm with professional efficiency. She might make it. But alone, without a mother to teach her to hunt and forage, without the protection and guidance cubs needed for their first 18 months, the odds weren't good. Maybe 30% survival rate for an orphaned cub. Less with an injured paw that would make climbing and digging difficult. Nature was harsh with the wounded. Sarah nodded and said nothing. What was there to say? That she'd broken protocol? That she'd risked her own safety and possibly doomed the cub to a slower death by teaching her that humans meant help? The vet didn't press. He finished bandaging her arm and told her to get to a hospital for proper stitches and a tetanus shot. Sarah drove herself to the medical center in Eureka, her arm throbbing with every heartbeat, her mind replaying those 3 seconds when the cub had looked at her before fleeing into the forest. 12 stitches closed the deepest furrows. The ER doctor, a woman named Patterson who'd treated her share of wildlife-related injuries, worked with efficient sympathy and asked no questions Sarah didn't want to answer. Tetanus shot, antibiotics, instructions to watch for signs of infection. Sarah accepted it all numbly, thanked the doctor, and drove back to the ranger station to file her incident report. Her supervisor, a man named Henderson who'd been with the Forest Service for 30 years, read the report in silence and then looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen plenty of rangers make the choice between protocol and conscience. "You know you shouldn't have approached," he said quietly. Not angry, just tired. Just stating fact. "I know," Sarah said. "You could have been seriously hurt. That cub could have done worse than scratch you." "I know." Henderson sighed and filed the report without further comment. A gentle reminder about protocol and distance. A note in her file. Nothing that would damage her career, but something that would be remembered if she made similar choices in the future. Sarah accepted the reprimand without argument and went back to work. She never searched for the cub, never tried to track or locate the animal or find out if she'd survived. That wasn't how wilderness worked, and Sarah knew it. You did what you could in the moment you were given, and then you let nature take its course. Trying to follow up, trying to monitor, trying to maintain connection, that was how you created habituated animals, bears that lost their fear of humans, creatures that ended up shot because they wandered into campgrounds looking for the help they'd learned humans might provide. Sarah had already broken enough rules, she wouldn't break that one. But she thought about the cubs sometimes, usually during quiet moments on patrol, or when she encountered other black bears in the forest, always at a distance, always maintaining proper protocol. She wondered if the young bear had survived, if she'd learned to hunt and fish despite her injured paw, if she'd found den sites for winter and emerged healthy each spring. She wondered if the cub ever remembered the human who'd freed her, or if that moment had been erased by instinct and time, forgotten as wild things forget. Sarah took Emma on her first camping trip when she turned 2, just the 2 of them, and a tent pitched in a developed campground where the bathrooms had running water, and other families provided a buffer of civilization against the wild. Emma had been enchanted by everything, the way firelight danced against tent fabric, the sound of wind through trees, the taste of marshmallows burned black over flames. At 3, Sarah taught her to identify animal tracks in mud, showing her the difference between deer hooves and raccoon hands, the distinctive pattern of coyote prints. At 4, Emma could move quietly enough through the forest that deer wouldn't startle, could name 6 different bird calls, loved the wilderness the way Sarah did, with wholehearted wonder and no fear. When Emma turned 4 in March, she begged for a camping trip to Grandma Sarah's forest. Not the developed campgrounds with their manufactured safety and crowds of strangers. The real forest, she said, her small face serious with the importance of this distinction. Where Grandma worked, where the trees grew so tall, you couldn't see their tops, and streams ran cold and clear over stones smoothed by centuries of water. Where wild things lived, undisturbed by human noise and commerce. Sarah felt her heart swell with pride and something deeper, the knowledge that she was passing something essential to this child, some understanding of humanity's place within nature rather than above it. She planned the trip for mid-April, carefully choosing the timing. Late enough that the snowmelt would be mostly finished, trails accessible and safe. Early enough that the weather would still be cool, mosquitoes minimal, the summer crowds of hikers and campers not yet descended on the wilderness. She chose a location she knew intimately, a small clearing near a tributary stream about 3 miles from the nearest road, beautiful and safe and rich, with the kind of details a 4-year-old would find endlessly fascinating. Michelle came too, and Emma's father, David. 3 generations, 1 tent, 2 days in the wilderness to celebrate Emma's birthday properly. The first day unfolded like a gift. Emma splashed in the stream, shrieking with delight at the cold water, collecting smooth stones in her jacket pockets until they bulged. She marveled at banana slugs, those prehistoric-looking creatures that seemed too absurd to be real, and studied pillbugs with the intense concentration scientists bring to microscopes, watching them curl into perfect spheres when touched. They roasted hot dogs over a campfire Sarah built while teaching Emma about fire safety and forest responsibility, told stories as darkness settled over the clearing, watched stars emerge in a sky unpolluted by city lights, more stars than Emma had ever seen, enough stars to make her ask questions Sarah couldn't answer about infinity and space and whether other people on other planets were looking back at them. Emma fell asleep in her sleeping bag, clutching a pine cone like a teddy bear, and Sarah lay awake listening to her granddaughter's soft breathing, feeling a contentment so profound it almost hurt. This was everything, this moment, this child, this forest. The knowledge that she was giving Emma something no amount of money could buy: connection to wilderness, understanding of her place in the natural world, memories that would shape her entire life. Sarah fell asleep counting her granddaughter's breaths like prayers. The next morning arrived cold and overcast, clouds moving in from the coast, carrying the promise of rain. Sarah woke early, old habit from decades of ranger work, and started a fire while the others slept, nursing the flames with dry kindling and patience until they caught and held. By the time Emma emerged from the tent, rubbing sleep from her eyes with small fists, Sarah had coffee brewing in a battered percolator and oatmeal warming over the flames. They ate breakfast together, Michelle and David planning a short hike to a viewpoint Sarah had recommended, while Sarah offered to stay at camp with Emma, who seemed more interested in playing near the stream than walking through forest. The plan was simple, safe, routine. Michelle and David would hike for 2 hours, be back by noon. Sarah and Emma would explore the immediate area around camp, maybe build a fairy house from sticks and moss, look for more pillbugs, practice skipping stones in the stream. Sarah had done this 100 times with 100 different groups, maintained base camp while others explored, kept the fire going, prepared lunch, enjoyed the quiet. There was no reason to expect anything different. No reason to worry. Sarah called for Emma. Her voice echoed through the trees, desperate and sharp, cracking on her granddaughter's name. "Emma! Emma, where are you?" No response, just the forest absorbing her panic, swallowing the sound, and giving nothing back. She called again, louder, her ranger training battling with grandmother terror. "Stay calm, be systematic, don't waste energy on panic." But panic wasn't something you could simply decide not to feel when your 4-year-old granddaughter had vanished into wilderness that could kill a grown adult if they made the wrong choices. Sarah grabbed her radio with shaking hands and forced herself to follow protocol, called dispatch, provided coordinates with a precision born from decades of practice, her voice steadier than her hands as she reported, "Missing child, female, age 4, pink jacket, purple boots, last seen at camp approximately 5 minutes ago. Search and rescue teams mobilizing. 40 minutes out, maybe less if they pushed it." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and clipped the radio to her belt, knowing she couldn't wait 40 minutes. Wouldn't wait. Couldn't stand still while Emma was out there somewhere, lost or hurt or scared. She began a systematic grid search, the same efficient pattern she'd taught to trainee rangers, the same sweep that covered maximum ground in minimum time while ensuring you didn't miss anything. Her eyes scanned for small footprints, for broken vegetation, for any sign of recent passage through the undergrowth. Her mind catalogued dangers with terrible clarity. The stream running, high and fast with snowmelt, water cold enough to induce hypothermia in minutes, steep embankments where a child could fall and break bones, dense undergrowth where a small body could lie hidden from searching eyes, and bears, always bears in this territory, black bears mostly harmless but unpredictable when surprised or with cubs. She found the tracks near the stream's edge, pressed into soft mud where the bank sloped down to water. Emma's small shoe prints, distinctive treads from her new purple hiking boots that she'd been so proud of, heading north along the bank. Sarah's heart lurched with relief and dread simultaneously. Relief because she had a direction, a trail to follow, evidence that Emma was moving under her own power. Dread because the stream was running dangerously high from snowmelt, the water swift and brutally cold, the current strong enough to sweep a 4-year-old off her feet if she ventured too close to the edge. Sarah followed the tracks at a run, calling Emma's name between ragged breaths, branches whipping at her face, thorns catching at her uniform. 1 hour became 2, 2 became 3. The temperature was dropping as clouds thickened overhead, wind picking up, carrying the smell of rain from the coast. Emma was wearing only a light jacket over her t-shirt, enough for playing near a warm campfire, nothing close to adequate for extended exposure. Sarah knew the physiology too well. 4-year-olds had high surface area to mass ratios, lost body heat 4 times faster than adults. Hypothermia could set in within 30 minutes in 40-degree water. Emma had been gone for 3 hours. Sarah had pulled bodies from wilderness before. Hikers who'd gotten lost, underestimated the terrain, succumbed to exposure or injury, or simply catastrophically bad luck. Children too, though those were mercifully rare enough that each one burned itself into memory, rare enough that Sarah still remembered their names, their faces in the photographs families had provided for identification. She knew the statistics on hypothermia, knew the stages like a terrible poem memorized against her will: shivering, confusion, loss of coordination, unconsciousness, death. Knew that a 4-year-old in wet clothes in 40-degree temperatures had maybe 4 to 6 hours before her body shut down completely. Her mind refused to complete the calculation her training had already finished. Then Sarah saw the other tracks. Not Emma's small shoe prints. Something else, large, heavy. 4-toed prints with claw marks extending well beyond the pad impressions, pressed deep into the mud, padding alongside Emma's trail, sometimes overlapping the small boot treads. Sarah's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Bear tracks. Fresh, so fresh that water was still seeping into the depressions in the mud, following her granddaughter's path. A bear had picked up Emma's scent and was tracking her. Sarah's training said to make noise, to announce her presence, to give the bear opportunity to flee before a dangerous encounter occurred. Black bears were generally non-aggressive, avoided humans when possible, only attacked when cornered or protecting cubs. But training couldn't override the primal terror of a grandmother whose 4-year-old granddaughter was being stalked by a 500-pound predator with claws that could disembowel an adult human with a single swipe. Sarah abandoned caution and crashed through the underbrush, following the twin trails, child and bear, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might stop entirely, thought her chest might simply split open from the force of it. She broke into a clearing near the stream and froze. The scene before her made no sense. Her brain couldn't assemble the pieces into a coherent picture, couldn't make the image before her resolve into something that matched any model of reality she possessed. Emma's small form lay motionless on the muddy bank, curled on her side maybe 15 feet from the water's edge, skin pale as paper, lips blue. And over her, around her, massive and unmistakable, was a black bear, a large female, easily 500 pounds, her body curled in a protective semicircle around the child, like a living fortress, like a mother around her newborn. The bear's distinctive white chevron chest marking caught the grey daylight filtering through clouds. Sarah's vision tunneled. Her knees buckled. Time stopped. Everything she knew about black bear behavior said this was impossible. Bears didn't approach unconscious humans, didn't curl protectively around human children, didn't stay near vulnerable prey without reason. They fled from human scent, or they attacked if they felt threatened. They didn't protect, didn't wait, didn't look at you with eyes that held recognition and something that looked terrifyingly like patience, like purpose, like they'd been waiting specifically for you to arrive. Sarah's voice came out broken, barely a whisper, her throat so tight she could barely force words through it. Please. She didn't know what she was asking for. Permission to approach. Understanding of this impossible scene. A miracle already granted but not yet fully comprehended. The single word hung in the cold air between grandmother and bear, between two creatures who should have been enemies, predator and protector, locked in a tableau that defied every principle of wildlife biology, Sarah had ever learned. The bear's response shattered Sarah's understanding of animal intelligence completely. The massive animal deliberately shifted her body away from Emma, uncurling slowly, each movement careful and intentional, creating space between herself and the child, making room for Sarah to approach, not a reflexive response, not instinct, a conscious decision, an act of communication so clear it needed no translation. "I have kept her safe. Now you take her." Sarah dropped to her knees beside Emma, her hands shaking so violently she could barely control them as she reached for her granddaughter. She checked for a pulse first, weak but present, fluttering against her fingertips like a trapped bird, breathing shallow but steady, each small breath a gift. Emma's clothes were damp, her exposed skin dangerously cold to the touch, lips blue from oxygen deprivation and dropping core temperature. But her chest, Sarah pressed her palm flat against Emma's small chest, her core was warm. Warmer than it should be after 3 hours of exposure in 40-degree temperatures, warmer than it had any right to be for a child found unconscious near a freezing stream. Sarah's eyes darted to the muddy bank, reading the story written in disturbed earth and drag marks the way she'd been trained to read evidence of wildlife movement. The scuff marks were unmistakable, leading from the water's edge to this spot 10 feet away on higher ground, deep furrows in the mud where something heavy had been dragged. Emma's boots showed mud consistent with having been in the water, not just splashing at the edge, but submerged, the leather soaked through, vegetation caught in the laces. She'd fallen in or waded too deep, had been swept downstream or simply collapsed from the shock of cold water hitting her small body. And the bear had found her, had pulled her from the water. The evidence was there in the mud, in the drag marks, in the way Emma's body lay, positioned away from the dangerous current. The bear had found this dying child and had done what no wildlife textbook said was possible. She'd intervened, dragged Emma to safety, curled her massive, warm body around the small human, and held her there, for hours, keeping her warm enough to survive, keeping her alive. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. Not fear. She'd moved past fear into territory that had no name in her vocabulary of ranger protocols and wildlife management strategies. The bear wasn't protecting territory, wasn't exhibiting maternal instinct toward her own offspring. This was no case of confused identity, no bear cub mistaken for a human child. This was something else entirely. The bear was protecting Emma, Sarah's granddaughter, a human child who had no connection to her except through one woman who'd freed her from a trap 5 years before. The bear had found a child in danger, hypothermic, drowning, dying, and had done what had been done for her. She'd saved a life. Sarah lifted Emma carefully, wrapping her own jacket around the small, cold body, her movements gentle but urgent, because every second still mattered. She needed to get Emma warm, needed to check for water in her lungs, needed medical intervention immediately. Hypothermia treatment required slow, careful rewarming. Too fast, and you could cause cardiac arrest, could kill someone you were trying to save. But before she turned to run back to camp and the radio and help, Sarah looked at the bear. Those brown eyes met hers across 3 feet of space. Recognition was mutual and complete and overwhelming. Sarah knew this bear knew Sarah. 5 years had passed, but neither had forgotten. The bear touched her nose to Sarah's hand, gentle, deliberate, a gesture that lasted only a moment, but carried the weight of 5 years and 2 rescues and something that felt impossibly like gratitude. Then the massive animal backed away slowly, deliberately, 10 feet, then 20, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large and powerful. But she didn't leave. She sat, watching, guarding, making sure Sarah could carry Emma safely away. The search and rescue helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, its rotors beating the air over the clearing where Michelle and David waited in agony, having returned from their hike to find camp empty and Sarah's frantic radio transmissions painting every parent's worst nightmare. The sound of the helicopter was a physical thing, a percussion that shook the air and sent birds exploding from trees in panicked flight. Sarah emerged from the forest at a dead run, Emma limp in her arms, and EMTs swarmed them the moment she broke into the clearing. Professional hands took Emma from Sarah's arms with efficient gentleness, laying her on a stretcher, stripping away wet clothes with practiced speed, wrapping her in thermal blankets that crinkled like aluminum foil. Someone started an IV line for warm fluids while someone else placed oxygen sensors on her small fingers. The choreography of emergency medicine, each person knowing their role, moving with the coordination that comes from training and repetition, and the absolute necessity of getting it right because a child's life hung in the balance. The lead EMT, a woman named Janet, who'd worked wilderness medicine for 15 years and had seen more than her share of hypothermia cases, did a quick assessment with hands that moved with absolute certainty. Checked pulse, respiration, pupil response, slid a thermometer under Emma's tongue and waited for the digital readout. Her expression shifted from professional concern to something else, confusion mixed with relief, the look of someone whose experience doesn't match what the data is telling them. Her core temperature is 89 degrees, Janet said quietly, looking up at Sarah with eyes that had seen too many bodies pulled from wilderness, too many children who didn't make it home. Severe hypothermia but stable, vital signs are better than they should be. She paused, recalibrating. How long was she missing? 3 hours, Sarah said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. Maybe a little more? Janet's eyes narrowed slightly, the mental calculation visible on her face. 3 hours in these temperatures, in wet clothes? She looked back at Emma, at the readings on the portable monitors. What kept her warm? Was there a shelter? Did she find someplace protected? Sarah opened her mouth, closed it. How could she explain what she'd seen? How could she describe a wild bear curled protectively around a dying child, maintaining enough body heat to keep her alive through hours of exposure? It sounded like a fairy tale, like something invented by a desperate grandmother trying to make sense of a miracle, like the kind of story that would get her psychiatric evaluation instead of belief. I don't know, Sarah heard herself say. The lie tasted bitter, felt like betrayal somehow, but what else could she say? I found her on the bank. She was already hypothermic. Janet nodded, accepting this non-answer because there was work to do and questions could wait. Michelle was crying. David was white-faced with shock, and Emma needed to be airlifted to the hospital in Eureka immediately. They loaded the stretcher into the helicopter, Sarah climbing in beside her granddaughter because nothing in the world could have prevented her from staying with Emma. Michelle and David would follow by car. The helicopter lifted with a roar, carving through grey sky, and Sarah held Emma's small hand while machines beeped and Janet monitored vital signs with professional intensity. At the hospital, doctors worked for 6 hours to slowly warm Emma's body to restore normal function to organs that had begun the process of shutting down from cold. They used warming blankets and heated IV fluids and careful monitoring because rewarming hypothermia patients too quickly could cause cardiac arrest, could kill someone you were trying to save. Sarah sat in the waiting room with Michelle and David, all three of them hollow-eyed with exhaustion and fear, waiting for news that seemed to take forever to arrive. The doctor who finally emerged was a younger woman named Chen. no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, who looked tired but cautiously optimistic. Emma was stable, she said, core temperature rising steadily, no signs of permanent damage to organs or brain function. No water in her lungs, which suggested she hadn't actually been submerged long enough to aspirate. They wanted to keep her for observation, at least 48 hours, but the prognosis was good. Better than good. Emma was lucky, Dr. Chen said, impossibly lucky. The kind of lucky that made medical professionals shake their heads and use words like miracle and unexplained. An old ER doctor named Morrison came to see Sarah later that evening, after Emma had been moved to a regular room and was sleeping peacefully, colour slowly returning to her cheeks. Morrison had been practicing emergency medicine for 40 years, had seen countless wilderness rescues, knew the statistics on child hypothermia survival better than almost anyone. He'd reviewed Emma's case and had questions that weren't in the official medical record. He found Sarah in the hallway outside Emma's room, staring at nothing, her arms wrapped around herself. He sat down beside her without asking permission and was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice gentle. The EMT said you couldn't explain how your granddaughter stayed warm enough to survive 3 hours of exposure in 40-degree temperatures. Sarah looked down at her hands, at the scars on her forearms, 4 pale lines against weathered skin, faded but never truly gone. But you can explain these scars, Morrison said quietly. It wasn't a question. 3 days after Emma's release from the hospital, Sarah did something she'd never done before in 20 years of ranger work. She returned to the clearing alone. Not for documentation or investigation or any official purpose. For herself, for understanding, for closure to something that had broken open her conception of what was possible between humans and wild things. Dawn light filtered through the pines as she made her way to the exact spot where she'd found Emma and the bear, her boots following a path she could have walked blindfolded. The clearing looked different in morning light, peaceful, ordinary, showing no evidence of the miracle that had occurred there 3 days before. Just mud and stones and the endless whisper of the stream running over rocks worn smooth by time. Sarah sat on a fallen log and waited. She brought nothing but herself and a need to understand, to find some explanation for what had occurred that wouldn't shatter her understanding of biology and behavior and the fundamental rules that governed how different species interacted. 1 hour passed. 2. The forest woke around her in stages, birds calling their territories, squirrels chattering irritation at her presence, the endless, small sounds of a living ecosystem going about its business. Sarah was about to leave, accepting that some questions had no answers, that some moments existed in isolation without explanation or repetition, when she heard movement in the underbrush, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of something large moving through the forest without fear. The bear emerged from the tree line slowly, her movements calm and purposeful. She approached to within 15 feet, closer than any truly wild bear should allow, closer than Sarah had ever been to an adult black bear outside of the impossible circumstances 3 days before, and sat. Those brown eyes held Sarah's for a long moment, neither afraid, neither threatening. Just recognition passing between 2 creatures who'd intersected twice in 5 years, who'd saved each other's young, who shared something the scientific literature had no words to describe and no framework to explain. Then Sarah saw it. On a flat rock near where Emma had lain unconscious, something had been placed with obvious intention, wild berries, a small cluster of them, arranged in a tight group, not scattered randomly as if dropped by a bird or knocked loose by wind, not crushed or half-eaten as they would be if a bear had not been feeding. Deliberately placed, deliberately arranged, the kind of symbolic gesture that every wildlife biology textbook said was impossible for a bear to conceive of, much less execute. Sarah's vision blurred with tears she didn't understand, didn't try to name or explain. She looked up, her eyes finding the bears across the clearing. The massive animal was already moving away, turning back toward the forest, her distinctive white chevron marking visible as she moved through dappled sunlight. The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, looked back once, a final acknowledgement, a farewell, then disappeared into the shadows between trees. Sarah sat in that clearing until the sun reached its peak, unable to move, unable to process what she'd witnessed. Bears don't arrange food. They don't create symbols. Every wildlife biologist will tell you this with absolute certainty, backed by decades of research and observation. Feeding behavior is opportunistic, driven by hunger and availability and seasonal necessities, not by symbolism or gratitude or any emotion more complex than the drive to survive. But Sarah knows what she saw. The bear had left something, not food for sustenance, a message, an offering. Gratitude answered with gratitude. Life for life. Sarah's hands shook as she walked back to her truck, her eyes blurred with tears she couldn't explain and didn't try to justify. She was a scientist, a ranger with 20 years of experience. She understood animal behavior, territorial patterns, maternal instinct, the limits of cognition in non-human species. None of it explained what had happened. The bear had found Emma, not just any child, but Sarah's grandchild, carrying perhaps some scent trace of the woman who'd saved her years before, had protected her from death, had waited for rescue, had remembered the human who freed her from a trap when she was small and terrified and alone, and had somehow, impossibly, returned the favor. If you've ever witnessed a moment when an animal showed you something profound, something that changed how you see the natural world, share your story in the comments. If this moves you, write. Animals remember kindness. These connections are real. They transcend our scientific models and our assumptions about consciousness and memory. They need to be honored. Life for life. That's what old Dr. Morrison had said when Sarah visited him weeks later, needing to tell someone who might understand, who wouldn't dismiss her experience as delusion or stress-induced hallucination. The bear remembered being small, trapped in pain, remembered the human hands that freed her despite the cost of torn flesh and broken protocol. And when she found another small creature in danger, cold and unconscious and dying by the water, she did what had been done for her. She saved a life. She kept watch until help arrived. She gave back what had been given. Sarah still works as a forest ranger in northern California. Emma is 9 now, healthy and bright and full of questions about the natural world, with no memory of that April day when hypothermia nearly claimed her. Her brain protected her from the trauma, but sometimes she tells her grandmother about dreams she has, warm and safe in darkness, surrounded by something large and gentle that kept the cold away. Sarah never corrects her, never explains. Some truths are too fragile for explanation, too profound for words. Sarah carries a photo in her patrol truck now, a trail camera image captured 2 months after Emma's rescue. A large female black bear with a distinctive white chevron marking on her chest, thriving and healthy, her coat glossy with good nutrition. 2 small cubs play nearby, tumbling over each other near the same stream where their mother once saved a human child. The bear is teaching them to fish, showing them how to turn over rocks to find grubs, passing on knowledge the way mothers do. Sarah sees the image and understands something most people never learn. We share